Okay, hello. Now I'm going to talk about Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. It has been one of the greatest books I've ever read. Now I've read the full version, but when I was in high school, I read a short version. That that was what motivated me to read this new story, this new version of the story. Okay, talking about of what I'm going to say of the timetable I'm going to have while speaking, I'm going to start with the contextual framework. I'm going to talk about a little bit about Mark Twain, which was the author of this story, uh, and telling you something a little bit is that Mark Twain had this story as one of his greatest masterpieces, as well as Huckleberry Finn. Tom Sawyer was a kind of autobiography because he used a lot of things from his own life and put it into the story. Okay, then I'm going to talk about a little bit about the movement Mark Twain used when writing this story. Then something a little bit of who can read this story. I'm going to be a little bit short in that way because there is not too much to say about it. Because I will try to be very, very punctual when talking about. Okay, then I'm going to talk about the semantic framework. What I'm going to say, I'm going to give my own opinion of what I understood when I was reading the book, what the author tried to say, and I understood. Also, I'm going to talk about a little bit of some critics I read of other commentators. In fact, almost all of them were really positive. But I also read something about the American government that prohibited this book for a short time because of what Mark Twain was saying in that story. Okay, finally, I'm going to give a short and brief conclusion about what I read and all the critics I'd say and all the critics I read before. Okay? I hope you enjoy what I'm going to say, and please, I hope you like it. Okay, now to begin with the contextual framework, I'm going to start saying something about Mark Twain, who was the author of this masterpiece. In fact, his real name was not Mark Twain. That he used that name when he started to write. In fact, his real name was Samuel Langhorne Clemens. He was a writer and comedian, an American writer and comedian, who was raised up in Missouri. That was the state or the name of the state that he used in Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn, which were his greatest masterpieces. Now, talking about a little bit of his life, he started to work because of his father's death. As he was one of the boys of the house, he had to start to work, and he started to work in newspapers. That's why he was really in touch with writing, with literature, with all of this. Now, he was considered the father of North American literature because of his greatest masterpieces, that was that was Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He really liked to use a little bit of his life in his stories. That is why in Tom Sawyer he used Missouri and Saint Petersburg, as he was raised in Missouri and in the small town called Hannibal, but he just decided to change it to St. Petersburg, not to be so obvious. Not really obvious, not to be so mean, or yes, to be so obvious that he was raised up in Hannibal. So that's why he decided to change it to St. Petersburg. Okay, now talking about the movement this story belonged to, it is realism. Mark Twain was one of the realistic authors, as well as Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leon Tolstoy, and Henry James, who was a British author. Realism, it was the way how through literature, the authors put the real situation that was happening. That is why during Tom Sawyer, uh, Mark Twain put something about slavery, what Missouri was facing during the time he wrote it. It was in 1876. As well as something about the American culture, which has been really not noticeable when a foreign person goes to the US. When someone goes to the US, at first they are really nice, they are really kind, they try to help you, but then they find a way to use you. They can be a little bit users in that way, and that's what Tom Sawyer does in all story. He puts different people to do what he was told to do, and that is why it's really, I will say that's really clear that it is an American person and that it is an American context where this story is developed. Now, I would say that Tom Sawyer is a really difficult book to read because you need to be really, really informed of the contextual framework that is behind the story. You need to know something about Missouri, something about the Mississippi River, and in fact something about the author, about Mark Twain. Mark Twain, I think that tried to write this story for all kind of publics, but during the period that he wrote it, that it was 1876, I guess everyone would understand it and would figure out everything that was going there. But I would say that nowadays it's really difficult to understand the book because, well, it was written almost 2 centuries ago, and it's, well, we need to be really informed of what is behind the story, all the context that it is developed, what was happening during that period, what the slavery that Missouri was facing, and also something about the American culture, about the downside of the American culture itself. Now, carrying on with the semantic framework, I would say that Mark Twain tried to use a really plain way to tell the story. He didn't use a lot of figures of speech as other people do. Maybe some authors from Romanticism. As he was part of the realism, he tried to. I would say that he used a really narrative and plain way to tell the story. The words he used were really clear. In fact, he didn't use a lot of weird words for us to understand. But what is the difficult way to understand this book? I would say that is because we don't know about the culture. For if you want to read this book, we need to be sure about some customs and some manners that American people have. In special, some people from Missouri and people who live in the countryside of the town, as Tom Sawyer was and as Mark Twain was raised up. Okay, now talking about the critics and the reviews this story received, they were almost all really good. In fact, they said it was a really nice masterpiece. That is why it became a masterpiece. But this story, as I mentioned, it was forbidden in the US because it showed how cruel was the situation in Missouri during that time. And that is why Mark Twain was forbidden during a period in the US. But then this story was recovered, and now it's one of the greatest stories that American literature has. Now, my own critic is it's not really difficult. It's not really different, sorry. This story was amazing. I really enjoyed while reading it. But I would say that it was kind of difficult for me to understand because I had to really look forward. I really like to look for its own information. I had to gather some new information for me to understand it. As I mentioned before, it is really difficult to read this book if we don't know about the American culture and the culture from the countryside and Missouri's culture. Okay, now another critic I read that I thought it was really nice and positive was how intelligent Mark Twain was when writing this story. How he used Tom Sawyer to, okay, how to use Tom Sawyer, a little boy, so innocent, so imaginative, so creative, to tell how Missouri was during that time. I mean, all the slavery, all the cruel reality that Missouri was facing. Some remarks that were said, it was that how smart Mark Twain was not to use an adult to tell this story, but to use a boy. I mean, be to tell this reality from the perspective of a little boy. I mean, how a boy, how a child faces all this situation so innocently without knowing what he's doing. I mean, without knowing if what he's doing is right or it is wrong. Now, as a conclusion, I will give you an advice. If you really are a good reader, you need to have this masterpiece in your literary background. This masterpiece was amazing for me to read because I was really in touch on how the American culture was, influenced a little boy to do many things, and how Mark Twain used Tom Sawyer to tell the situation that Missouri was facing, to tell, to tell all what he lived during his childhood and put it into some beautiful words to become this huge masterpiece of American literature.